Welcome to Mastering the Attention Economy podcast. I'm your host, Ari Lewis. Twice a week, we interview entrepreneurs, executives, and industry leaders on how to break through the noise and capture the audience's attention. Today's guest is Cristin Culver. Cristin is a VP and head of communications at Notarize. She has run PR at consumer tech companies including Pandora, Trulia, and most recently Opendoor, where she was head of local communications, running the disruptive real estate company's PR and communications in their existing and forthcoming markets across the U.S. She joined Opendoor in 2017 when the company was in 3 markets and left when they were in 21.
Hey, Ari, thanks for having me.
So, Cristin, thanks so much for joining me. I came across your great Twitter thread. You used to work at Opendoor as the head of local, PR and communications. First off, I'm sure many of the listeners didn't see the thread. Can you share sort of the inspiration of, why you wrote this great thread on why companies should invest more in local PR and sort of how that came about?
For sure. Yeah, I see this time and time again. When it comes to PR, I think people dream of, the big time headlines, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, but they forget that if they're in the customer acquisition zone where they need to get in front of customers who are making decisions, local is a really great place to be. And I think for tech brands, and I think all companies, it's one of those hidden in plain sight things where it's very obvious, but people aren't investing and taking the time to make that an important part of their comm strategy.
Yeah, and that's something we see a lot. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, right? So, I don't have that bias of I'm not on, New York or San Francisco, but, you have these tech companies, especially that are B2B, and, they want to announce those TechCrunch funding rounds and, those Wall Street Journal funding rounds, but they forget about like the customer that they're selling into, might live in Cleveland, Ohio. First off, how do you change that mindset? I think at the C-suite level, of telling those executives, hey, yeah, this funding round announcement's important, but so is reaching the customer that lives in Cleveland, Ohio, or Des Moines, Iowa, or Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah, I think it's it's going to be based on how the company is structured. Like at Opendoor, we were inherently local business. So we were headquartered in San Francisco, but we didn't operate at all in San Francisco. Our operations were in Phoenix, Charlotte, Orlando, Tampa, Minneapolis, every city in Texas, like you name it. So it was already the mindset at Opendoor. But for other companies, they need to think about where do their customers and their customers' customers actually sit, and how can they be influenced? So, the TV station that you grew up watching, the newspaper your parents still subscribe to and read every day, both are hugely influential and could be the secret weapon for most businesses to connect with their customers that they're courting, or the partners or the policymakers they want to influence. All of those people are very deeply influenced by local press, and people need to remember that and focus on it.
So, anecdotally speaking, what were some of the sort of, customer stories, customer experiences you heard? Like, you mentioned Phoenix, where, you guys got press in Phoenix. What would be a story where, okay, here's a press story in Phoenix, and then this is how it impacted our business, from whether it's we got some customers or maybe we got an employee out of it. Can you share some of those more personal stories?
Let me back up and say, specifically for like any of our markets, we were investing really heavily in direct mail and radio and some of these very traditional marketing channels. And the stories I heard time and time again when I talked to customers as we were like expanding or launching new markets, or just, growing our business in a city like Phoenix, was that they'd hear the radio ad or they would get the direct mailer in the mailbox and they'd have questions, or they'd say, the stories always went something along the lines of like the husband would look at the direct mailer and say, like, this looks like a scam and this sounds too good to be true, and want to throw it in the trash. And where local press came in and kind of filled that gap was that we told stories about their neighbors who had made the decision to kind of like go for this new concept and try this new thing versus listing their house on the market, and they had an amazing outcome. And those were the stories that influenced other customers, and from there it really got the flywheel going of word of mouth and recommendations and people telling everybody that they knew how easy it was to sell their house and that you should do it this way and not the traditional way. So those stories we heard over and over and over again. And then, I mean, any story that you'd be telling on the corporate level, from funding or economic development, all of those could and should be localized using data or examples. Like there's infinite ways to tell stories on the local level. You just have to kind of spend the time investing in understanding what's happening at the local level and what your customers are experiencing.
So when you talk about these experiences, say going back, we'll just continue to probably use Phoenix, Arizona for this. But if someone had a really great experience with Opendoor, are you guys pitching a reporter? I don't know, the local press in Phoenix about, hey, here's this great story. What does that positioning look like for the reporter, and how are you connecting with them?
Yeah, sometimes it would be like hinging on a story. The one that comes to mind, there was a man who had been homeless for a while and finally had gotten to a place in his life where he was buying his first house, and he was buying an open door house. And we found out about it, prior to him moving in, and um, together with the employees pooled money and furnished the house for him. So that was kind of one of those like magical surprise and delight moments that was really in line with the company's core values. And it was a great press story. You would see that story on local news if you turned on your news in any city USA tonight. Maybe not tonight in the current environment, but usually. So stories like that. But yeah, if we would hear about some really outlier story that was like very newsworthy, yes, those are the obvious ones. But I think the bread and butter is the the kind of like the basics of the business, telling those stories and using maybe data or some kind of like national news hook that's going on, um, to tie it to what's happening locally. Because local newsrooms, their mandate is to take what's happening on the national level and localize it. So if you can help a reporter do that, that's really like that will help you be successful. And then also think about most cities, they have at their main newspaper and at the Business Journal, they have economic development and business and tech reporters. So those reporters are really hungry to know what is going on in the local market. So if you're launching is a very obvious one, but if you're launching, if you're hiring, if you're doing something related to policy in the metro or in the state, those things are all interesting to local reporters and very influential. So think about that as you think about what could be, your local angle.
And that's a really good point with that local angle. I speak to a lot of local reporters in Cleveland, and coronavirus is obviously the big thing that everyone is covering and wants to cover. But sort of, yes, the national news is covering it, but like, how do you tie that, coronavirus story into a local story is such an important thing. And, it sort of sounds like what you all did, where you were localizing those stories. So you took a national trend and made it local. And there's so many follow-up questions I have, but one thing I wanted to ask, and probably we'll go back to some of your other answers, is, did you guys lead with, we're going to maybe tweet about a story that we experienced, or write a blog post about it and then pitch it to a reporter? Or was it more, we're going to lead with, let's get some press around it, and then we turn that into a piece of owned media content?
More likely the latter. Sometimes something was so great and it would turn into a content piece on the blog, but most often it would start as, a media pitch, and then maybe we do something with it after. But it just depends on the company and what your content strategy is and how much you're kind of leaning into to own content versus earned. At Opendoor, we were much more earned media. We had great relationships with local press across the US. So it was easy to kind of start there and then figure out what the strategy would be beyond that.
So, on the local press side, you're based in San Francisco. Did you find it difficult to, build those relationships with local reporters because, you weren't in, these local arenas? Or was it easy? And did it, I would say also, did it help that you guys did have, a few employees in that region as well, where like some companies, they might want to do local PR, but they don't actually have any employees present in that region.
Yeah, great question. And I think like the moment we're sitting in where everybody is at home and nobody's traveling is a great equalizer. But it was a little bit of both. Back in the day, I was there 2017, 18, 19, and 20, through early 2020. Yes, I was on planes a decent amount. There's a fair amount of FaceTime you have to put in to just, walk the walk and to show them you are here physically. And also, one thing that was unique to Opendoor is that every city had a GM. So it was essentially the CEO of that market. That person was the press contact. They ran the market. So we had a lot of local presence. So it was easier than some other companies who may have zero, operators in a market, but Opendoor did in a fair amount of employees, like Phoenix, multiple hundreds of employees, Dallas, hundreds of employees, Atlanta, that was the eastern hub for the company. So those were kind of an easier sell to say like we are actually here, but some of our smaller markets we still had a handful of employees. So yes, we were a great contributor to the local economy, and that those points of like having in-market teams are is what people should lean into. If you have it, definitely be sure to call it out. If you're hiring and you're going to be contributing to economic development and creating more jobs, that's a story. So make sure that reporters know that. And yes, call them up. Um, get meetings if you can in later in life, if we can get back on planes soon, you know do those strategic trips. Like FaceTime does matter, but I think 2020 has made it a little bit easier to do local press because we can all be in the Zoom room together.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive of the coronavirus. One of the few. So you talked about these local GMs. When you guys were setting these strategies, setting these narratives, did it come from the top that like here are the talking points, and then the local GMs would maybe add a little flavor style to their local region? How did that the narrative and message building occur, where like you wanted to obviously have alignment with the corporate side, but also add that local flavor as well?
It's both. So yeah, there was the story of Opendoor and the story of the business that we wanted to tell, but then every market was very unique. So yes, there needed to be localization of the message points and the kind of the why we were launching in that market, what was the market conditions, and that's what makes local press, especially if you're doing it in many many markets, it makes it really fun and challenging, is you really have to flex because especially in real estate one market might be hot, one market might be cold, sellers, buyers market. There's all these dynamics that make one market different than the other. And then the media markets are really different. So the media landscape is very, very different. What works in Tampa will not work in Salt Lake City, will not work in Dallas. Atlanta and Dallas are hard news markets. They're very much like if it bleeds, it leads, and harder news stories. But then you have other markets where they tend to air more towards like the human interest stories and more the consumer friendly stuff. And that's the challenge, but it's also really fun. So it is not something that you can create a blanket strategy for. This is where playbooks are really, really key. Create a playbook that can be run, but with the realization that you're going to have to flex on different message points, strategies, tactics, because no market will be the same. And I think if you're looking at like how do you approach local press and how do you decide what markets matter, um, that's going to obviously be very dependent on like what type of business you are. But I think a mistake that people make when they try to do local press is they want to do every market perhaps that they operate in. And I think you can't spread yourself that thin. So again, depending on what kind of business you are, think about what matters. So if it's customer acquisition, policy, and economic development per se. Those are just like maybe three key pillars of the business. Pick two out of three and then find those markets that align to like your two core pillars and then go from there. Like start small and then expand. Opendoor, when I joined, we were in three markets about to expand to four and then eventually every 2 to 4 weeks, we're expanding to a new market, ended up in 21 markets. So you can't do 21 at one time. It's easier to add one at a time. But for other companies, you also can't start with 50 markets. So start with your focus core markets that really matter to what the business problems and the metrics are that matter, and then go from there.
Yeah, that's a really great answer, and I think is also a good segue into, so say I'm joining a company, and I'm running local PR, or I'm running PR, and I'm looking at a local effort. When do you think, okay, we should do local PR versus when, okay, maybe we should just focus on national PR or just focus on certain sectors? I know one of the benefits you talked about in your Twitter thread was also the SEO realization that folks get, where like if they Google it, you'll see a local paper, and that gives instant credibility. How should one be thinking about it if they're trying to launch their own PR strategy, and trying to implement local as part of it?
Yeah, think about what the goal is. So for Opendoor, it was customer acquisition. It was how do we get more people to choose this new way of selling a house or buying a house versus the traditional way. And it was very influential for them to read about it in their local newspaper from the reporter that, has been covering the local real estate market most of the time for, at least a decade, very established reporters. But it's going to depend on the business and what your business goal is. So, I mean, even for things like funding announcements, which you think are like, okay, that belongs in the in the national press or in the tech press. If you are going to be hiring in a certain market, or if you're going to be expanding a physical footprint or anything that is going to help the business on a local level, you can pitch that to local press. I mean, when we did a very multiple hundreds of $1 million funding round at Opendoor, that was a local news story in Charlotte because we were going to be expanding the team, we were going to be getting larger office space, and we were going to be working with more customers. So that was, a story that was relevant to that reporter, and it ended up being great. But I think when you think about adding local in, it just depends. If you need to be in front of customers, you should be thinking about local.
So, I guess on a bit of a tactical level there. So, right, you guys do the PR announcement. I assume you do it with, a national, tier one publication, or you do it with a tech publication. Are you then, after that, like, are you sending them that story, or sending them a press release? Is it you already have a relationship with like that reporter in Charlotte? Like, what is that in that specific story? Like, what did that look like tactically from an execution point of view?
Yeah, we knew we were going to announce the funding. We had some markets the target markets that mattered, and it was important to let those markets know that this was kind of a development for the company and what it would mean for the local market. So we were going to ramp up hiring. We were going to ramp up other tactics. We were going to be increasing spending with local small businesses and agents and other tradespeople. So it mattered to their market, to their business community. So tactically, it was a direct conversation with the reporter. I think there's a lot of old school tactics that people think about, like press releases and other things, blog posts. But the reality is, on the local level, nothing beats that one-to-one conversation. So calling up a reporter that you have or want to have a relationship with, pitching them via email. That's kind of like the standard operating procedure in comms and in PR. And telling them what the story is. Also, like, keep it brief. This is what we're going to be announcing when, this is why it matters to the local market, and kind of what you can offer them. If you have a spokesperson they can talk to, or you have any kind of follow up, that's what those reporters are looking at to decide, instinctively, is this a local story for my readers? Does my audience care?
Got it. That's a great answer. And as we, begin to wrap things up, my one question I like to end it with is, if you were starting at Opendoor again, what would be that one thing you would maybe do differently that now, or what's that like one big takeaway, one lesson that you sort of learned?
I would build the playbooks earlier. I mean, we did it pretty early, but I would, week one, build the playbook and the very tactical kind of checklist of how to press launch a market. because when you're moving as fast as we were moving at Opendoor, like it had to be playbooked. So we did do that, but I would have done it, in week one, because then we could have refined it and got where we eventually got just a little bit faster. Um, because, the pace at which the launches were happening and everything was moving, that would have been a great guiding light to have on week one. Hindsight's definitely 2020. But it's something I would tell all of your listeners and viewers to do, is to think about what your playbook is, and to build it ASAP, especially if you don't have somebody on your comms team like solely devoted to local. Think about the elements of what the playbook could be. I have some thoughts, which I think they're like strategies to leverage customer stories, which you talked about, because you want to humanize a brand, bring it to life locally. You want to introduce new products, services, features, and partners, and then create news hooks using data, which could be internal data or external studies or local market reports. Just think about how all of those elements play for your business, and playbook them.
Great. Well, Cristin, so thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate your time. For those, maybe looking to follow you on social media or connect with you, where can they find you?
Yes, I'm at Cristin Culver. I spell it a little funky, CristinCulver. Follow me. We'll be doing more on local, I think, in the coming weeks. But I'm just ramping up my new role. I started as head of communications at Notarize, which is a really incredible company that's pioneered the ability to notarize documents digitally. And there's definitely a local component there. So stay tuned as I share more knowledge. But yes, you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn, and send me a message. Would love to chat.
Great. Well, awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.